I like to start with this Bruce Lee quote: absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. There's a lot of good stuff out there in the Agile community, but there's also a lot of stuff I wouldn't actually call good. I'm kind of known as a candid speaker on a lot of things, and I've seen a lot of things. In fact, if I kind of put on my time machine and go back to, I'm actually having troubles, there we go, to get a brief history of Agile. A lot of times we think it started with the Agile Manifesto, but actually it was in the 90s that Scrum was codified at an UPSLA conference. I remember attending a XP seminar with, well, not actually attending it. It was closed out and they wouldn't let me go. In extreme programming with Martin Fowler in '99 in Munich at a conference there. But that's when I got interested in it, saying, hey, what's the buzz here? This is pretty cool stuff. And that's what I would call the first generation of Agile. And that was pretty good stuff at the team level. And then Lean software, which had actually been mentioned by Bob Charette in the late 80s, and had actually been being done by one of my own guys, Jim Sutton, who's written a book on it. He'd been working on it in the 80s and 90s too, but it wasn't until the Mary and Tom Poppendieck's book on Lean software development came out in 2004 that it kind of got to be known as something that was happening. And that led to different team processes. Kanban started around 2005, Scrumban, which was originally a method of going from Scrum to Kanban. It was a transition approach, and then has morphed into an approach its own, which is basically, you can think of it as Scrum with Kanban methods in it, or practices, or you can think of it as Kanban with iterations, but it was kind of a hybrid approach or a transition. And then David Anderson, one of the thought leaders in the Kanban community, came up with what he calls the Kanban method. This is actually the cornerstone of Lean Kanban University, which I had helped form with David, but I'm no longer affiliated. Basically because, and we'll see this, it's a great tool, but I don't think it's a sufficient driver on its own. So there's been this first generation, the introduction of Lean, which then was taken advantage of using some of the Lean thoughts to create the second generation. And there's a lot to be learned by these, but there's also a lot that's missing. And that's really what this webinar is about, is how can we get it to see the bigger picture and move forward. So this is basically going to be the outline. What's the beginnings? What's the first generation? What can we learn? What was the challenge from that and the rise of the second generation? Contrasting first and second generation Agile, the case for the next generation of Agile, requirements for the next generation of Agile, and then Lean-Bond, the third generation, is what we use at Net Objectives as I won't call it, it's not really a hybrid approach, because a hybrid implies it's the integration of two things, when in fact it's looking at the two and then learning the foundational stuff underneath that and using that. Now, as I'm talking, I'm realizing I'm talking about different generations of Agile, and I really should say I really mean kind of at the team level. So I'm not really going to be talking about scale here. That might be actually an interesting webinar to look at as well, because you could take the first generation of Agile at scale being the Scrum of Scrums approach, which hasn't worked too well, and then we could talk about things like Save for Less or DAD or our own approaches which parallel those. But this webinar is going to be really more about at the team level. So let's take a look at that. And let's look at Scrum. Now, I'm not going to describe these. I'm assuming people pretty much know Scrum and Kanban to some level, because that would just be too much to go into. But we learned a lot from Scrum. Scrum is a very good team process or framework. I know it's not a process. I know it's not a method. I know it is a framework. I'll call it an approach to having effective software development. We've learned cross-functional teams are good. A cross-functional team is a team that has all of the capability to build the software needed. It's why we now talk about feature teams, the ability to build a feature. Feature teams are a better structure than, say, component teams, where you then have to get several components tied together. So a cross-functional team, a feature team, they're pretty comparable. It helps improve collaboration. It eliminates waste. A cadence can coordinate the different roles. So product owners know when they need to be ready for the team to tell them what, to build their backlog. Business people can understand when the demos are going to come, things of this sort. The iterations, the 2-week time boxing, hopefully you're at 2 weeks, not 4 weeks or 3 weeks, but whatever it is, it helps create discipline. And short-term planning can be accurate, so we can actually get some level of predictability. However, we've also learned something I'd call negative, which is there have been some negative learnings, which is basically that principles are needed to learn. All too often, we've seen that people do kind of not effective things because I don't believe they actually understand the principles underneath Scrum. I like a paraphrase of Deming I made: theory without experience is useless. Experience without theory is expensive. We kind of labor because we're not quite sure why this practice is a good idea. There's actually, in my mind, a lot of nonsense about why Scrum works. But let's look at some of the reasons. Why cross-functional teams manifest lean thinking, which is about flow, high productivity. It's actually about removing delays in the workflow that results in productivity and value and eliminates waste. Partially done work is with a cross-functional team is easier to avoid because you have all the people there who are needed. You don't have to wait for somebody. In fact, you don't have paperwork as much. There's not no documentation. You have the documentation you need, but you don't have a lot of documentation needed to build because everybody is there. We don't have handoffs in the normal sense. Rather, we're working together to build software. By incrementally developing what we need, we don't usually have extra features, or we can avoid it because we build enough, and then the product owner says, oh, we don't need this stuff. We've got the value we need. Let's move forward. We don't build too far in advance. We don't task switch because we're working on one thing. We finish it with our team, then we go on to the next thing. Finish it with our team, go on to the next thing. And we have few delays because all the people we need are right there. We're right there to help the people we need. And if you do good techniques like test-driven development, acceptance test-driven development, which is a lot easier when you have a cross-functional team, you can avoid defects to a very large extent. Also, even if you do make mistakes, and you will, that's what we do, meaning human beings, because of the short time from when you make the error until you find it, fixing it's way, way faster. So, developers have this tendency to think they spend a lot of time fixing bugs, but the real thing is they spend a lot of time finding the bug because they're onto something else by the time the defect's been made aware to them. So if you actually detect it extremely fast, even if you have to fix it, you fix it quick because you find it quickly and it doesn't escape the sprint, so there are fewer defects. Let's get really clear on this because team organization is extremely important. So I wanted to give a little example to make sure of some of the dynamics that are in play while illustrating really good Scrum at the same time. Back in, I think it was 2004, it might have been 2005, it was, I remember it was my second Lean software course I ever taught. It was down in California. It was a public class. I just had a few people in it. But I remember two of them in particular. One of them was the director of development. It was a small group. He had like 25 people, and his right-hand person, the architect team lead. And they were organized like this. They were organized into a UI team, a mid-tier team, and a database team. And we were having lunch together, I think, on the second day. And they said, this is how we're organized. And after you're talking about Lean, we'd only been talking about it for a day and a half, but we've been going about a lot of the principles. They said, this just doesn't seem like the right structure. It seems that the problem with this structure is we do our 2-week sprints or whatever it was back then. It was probably 4-week sprints. But we do our sprints, and then we have to integrate. So that delays a lot of the feedback we'd get otherwise. We're really not set up to get something built quickly because we have to have each of the teams build it. And even though they talk to each other during the build process, there's still a lot of integration at the end. They said, this just doesn't seem right. Yet Scrum teams are supposed to self-organize, right? And I said, well, actually, they're supposed to self-organize, but they're supposed to first organize into cross-functional teams. These are not cross-functional. These are just self-organizing. This is why I hear sometimes Scrum works because of self-organization, and I say,